So thank you all for joining this evening, and welcome to this class on the art and science of selling. I've always maintained that selling is the oldest profession. It's not the one you think, because you had to sell it first. So selling actually came before that profession. But I think there is always a combination of art and science and everything. And my goal this evening is to try and share a few ideas with you that I think will be interesting in terms of how to approach combining these two often disparate elements together in order to create a unique customer experience. And today it's all about the customer. We're going to talk much more about that as we go on. So this is a combination of professional selling skills, and you don't think of necessarily art as being a selling skill, but I really believe it is, because selling is about working with people, and working with people is, in every description, it's an art. You have to really figure out how to make the people around you, the ones who are buying from you, feel comfortable, and comfortable enough to give you money, essentially. So I think there is an 80-20 mix between art and science, and it may surprise you to think which one is which. Hang on one second and I'll tell you. So first is the art, and I think that is 20%. Now, it's a very, very important 20%, and it's actually what I'm going to talk about most in this case, is actually the art. But I do believe that 80% of it is science. Now, why do I say that? I have actually taught sales performance improvement, so sales process and professional B2B engagement. I've taught that in more than 190 countries through my career. And what I can tell you is this: every country to which I go, they say, you know, Gopal, I understand what you're saying. I understand all these sales tools, but it's different here. Really? Okay. Well, so I asked them a few questions. So do you have to go out and find prospects? Well, yeah, of course we do. But do you have to engage with them and try to get them to meet with you to understand their needs? Well, yeah, sure we do. Well, do you have to then formulate a value proposition so that they can understand what it is you're trying to present to them and the value of your solution? Well, yeah, of course we do. Yeah, right. And do you have to ever make a proposal and offer them your solution? Well, naturally we do. And then do you have to follow up with them and try to sell them more services eventually? Well, naturally we do that. Well, see, that's the funny part. Everyone else does the same thing. So that's why I come to the idea that 80% of selling is science, because it's a process. We'll talk about that at the end. But 80% is science because it can be made into and codified as a repeatable process. And that's really what we want to get to, is how can we make success repeatable? And the reason science is so important is because as an organization grows, one of the challenges you find is bringing new people into the organization. And many of my clients tell me, well, we'll just hire, good salespeople. Well, I understand that. But what makes them good? And how do you make good into great? Well, you need to have a process. You need to have some underlying principle of how you actually sell in your business environment to be successful. So that's why I say 80% is science, 20% is art. But what makes the art? Well, the art is actually why, for example, you would hire a Danish person to sell to Danish people. You hire a Swiss person to sell to Swiss people, a Frenchman to sell to French people, because that is the way in which they know how to approach and execute those activities. That's where the art comes in. And a great salesperson can seamlessly blend art and science together. You never know where one ends and the other begins, because they are fluid between them. And this is the true skill, in my opinion, of what a great salesperson really does, is they combine art and science. Now, what does that mean? Well, first thing you got to do is to get the right people on board. So a wonderful book by Jim Collins called Good to Great. And one of the principles in that book that I really like is this. He said, one of the skills of a true great leader is the ability to get the right people on the bus and to get the right people in the right seats. Well, what makes for the right people? You know, and I know there are loads and loads of these personality-based tests on the market. MBTI and DISC and personality profile and HDI. And there are a whole bunch of these things. And they are all terrific because what they do is they help you as a person put words around things for which you only have feelings. Why am I this way? Why do I react like this? Well, those kind of tests help you to figure out who you are as a person. But from a sales point of view, they don't really help more than trying to identify the right kind of personality that you're trying to hire. Because when you hire someone, you hire their personality, you get who they are. So one of the things you may want to look at doing is what we do, which is actually test for skills. So you build a skills profile and say that in our industry, the skills that we need to have a successful salesperson are the following, and then evaluate their skills based on that ideal success profile, if you will. That gives us the ability to, well, change things because skills can be learned. Personality is personality. They are who they are. They can change things, but they are generally who they are. And if you hire an experienced salesperson, they've been at being a salesperson for a while, so their personality usually is fairly well developed. And skills, however, can be changed because we can add skills. We can teach new skills, and that's one of the reasons why we focus on skills profiles, because that helps us to coach more effectively. Then we have to talk about mindset. Now, mindset is one of those things that has a very broad set of definitions, and the way I use it is this. And this is the example of mindset that I want to use, because for me, it's a turnaround in the way in which we approach selling, because we always think of selling as what am I going to do to convince this person to buy? Well, I want to use this expression, okay? So I want to change things around a little bit, and here is what I want to say, because this is my ethos in selling. Great salespeople never sell because everyone hates to be sold to. What they do is they help their customers to buy. Now, it's a small change of phrase, but it's a complete change of mindset. It's a total change in the way you approach a customer and the way you engage with them and in the way in which you help them through their buying journey, if you will. That's what great salespeople do, is help the customer to accomplish their objectives. And by doing that, of course, they follow along. They get the success as well. So let's dive into a little bit more of what that actually means. So how do we go about changing this mindset? Well, the first thing I think you have to do is to understand that it's not about the power you can project. This is the karate way of doing things. It's how much power can I use to land that punch? Well, that's the old way of selling, in my opinion. Today, it's more of the Tai Chi, if you will. It's how can I channel the customer's power and use it in my favor? Remember, great salespeople never sell. They help their customers to buy. So let's figure out the direction they're moving and help them move in that direction using our tools. So one of the things we want to do is to learn to work with a customer. It's a bit like dancing the tango, if you will. It's a lot easier to dance the tango if both partners know how to dance the tango. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of sore toes, actually, when people step on each other's toes. So dancing the tango means you have to know who's leading, who's following, and dance to the same music. So what we need to do is learn a few new dance steps, because things have changed. Things have changed a lot in the last 25 years, and they've accelerated in the last 5. And why do we need to do this? Because, well, the dance today is very different than it used to be before. It's not exactly the same dance. So one of the things that we need to understand is that the buying process of customers has changed. What's changed? Well, it's the internet. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But today, if you listen to people like Gartner and Forrester and IDC and others, what they'll tell you is that as much as 70% of a customer's buying journey is actually completed before the first contact with a potential vendor. Now, what that means is our window of opportunity to influence the customer is actually quite narrow. And it's not at the beginning of the process, it's at the end of the process. So we are left with a real challenge of how can we create value in that very short time to actually differentiate ourselves from potential competitors. Another element that's important to understand is this: 75% of B2B buyers today use social media to research potential vendors. They're looking for specific expertise. They're looking for knowledge. They're looking for experience. They're looking for industry expertise. So they are actually out there trolling social media. And it's amazing how many traditional industries, and how many new ones actually, are very poor at actually presenting themselves in the electronic medium. Yes, they put effort into their websites, but websites are not where people are necessarily looking, because a website doesn't tell me Matthias works for this company and he knows these 3 things which are critical for my project. So I want to find him, not his company. So the company for which he works, well, that's great. I can do business with them, but I want to do business with him first. And that is where social media comes to play a very important role in the way in which we engage with customers, even before they actually contact us. So this communication process starts within that 70%. The third element, 90% of decision makers today say that they never respond to cold calls from vendors. Now, that's a bit of a scary number if you think that. It's like, well, how am I going to create new leads? Well, that's kind of where the marketing comes in. So that's where the other figures come in. So we need to do more inbound marketing. We need to do a better job of presenting ourselves in a way that we get found rather than us finding them. So when they have a need, they come and find us. We also need to improve the quality of our approach so that we do the research in advance, and it's not a cold call, it's a warmed call. So we start the communication process early, and we follow it up, and we build that relationship and trust throughout the process. The last figure is this: 3/4 of buyers in the B2B space, and that's my specialty, they said that they choose a salesperson and the organization that is the first to add value and insight to their buying process. Now, what does that mean? It means providing them the kind of information for which they are looking in the buying process. They're trying to actually learn about products and services that solve their particular problems. And if we can help them even before they have contact with us, they are potentially customers for us. So what it means is we have to keep up with the evolution. There is a big evolution going on in the customer world, and they are evolving faster than many sales organizations are. They're already way ahead of the curve, and many sales organizations are actually quite far behind it. They're working, pretty much in the Stone Age in many cases, and the customers are working in the digital age. So this situation really has to change. Now, for many of you attending, it might be interesting to think what the world was like before the internet, because it was a very different world. I mean, yes, we had service providers. We did have search capabilities. We had YouTube as well. We had Twitter, but it was in very different forms than you find it today. We actually had to go places and engage with real people rather than shouting at each other across social media. But what does this mean? In those days, it was all about the salesperson and about the customer, because the salesperson was the primary source of information about the company, its products, its services, and capabilities. So customers actually wanted to meet us. In fact, that was the primary way in which we exchanged information. I mean, we were asking each other questions, providing each other information, and there was a way in which we could actually engage with people because we were the source of information. Of course, we had messaging. It looked a little different than it does today, but yeah, messaging was there as well. And believe it or not, for many of you, this will be a huge surprise. Telephones can be used to make calls and talk to people. Really, 2 people on the end of the same line talking to each other. It's not all about photos and text. So there was differences there in the way in which we engaged. So what changed all this? Well, obviously, you know the answer. It was the internet. The internet has been, in many ways, a great equalizer, because access to information is no longer limited by the bottleneck of the salesperson. The salesperson has now sort of been relegated to one of the many sources of information, not by any means the only source, and often not the most important one. So in many cases, for example, instead of asking a salesperson about the company, I go to their website, I go to web forums, and I talk to other customers, for example. So I get information, I get reference information effectively without actually having the involvement of any of that organization. So this has really created a very different scenario today. And customer power is very much on the rise. It's a very different situation today than it was, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and certainly more than it was 25 years ago. Today, it's all about the customer. They are the ones effectively driving this change. It's one of the reasons why, for example, inbound marketing now has taken very much precedence over outbound marketing. It's not to say that outbound marketing is dead. I mean, the whole media industry would pretty much die without outbound marketing. There are still messages you want to get out to your customers, but more and more it's about letting them find you, and that's the inbound marketing. So customer power is very much in the fore. And the reason is because of this. They can find access to information in ways that are 10 times easier than they could find before. If they wanted to find information before, they would do the same kind of research. But what it meant is calling their friends and saying, well, have you ever heard of this company? Have you heard of these guys or this product? Have you seen this? Have you used this? No, I haven't, but I know my friend Jeff has. Well, let me connect you to him. So the networking was very, very important. And many times they simply couldn't find information. But today, one page of Google and off you go. You can find almost anything. So whether you like it or not, Google is oftentimes your best salesperson or your worst one. So this is some of the ways in which customers spend their time during the buying process. That's 70%, if you will, that's completed before the first contact with an individual. You can see here that they spend a very narrow portion of that time, about 1/6 of their time, actually meeting with potential suppliers. Now that doesn't seem like very much time. And if they're talking to 3 or 4 or 5 suppliers, potential suppliers, well then that 17% is actually divided between all of those. So it is very much a narrow sliver of opportunity that we have to influence the customer. What is interesting is this, that 27% that you see up there, that potentially can be an interesting time. This is where, for example, having good professional profiles on social media can play an important role in being found when they're looking for the kind of skills and experience and capabilities that will help them in the project for which they're working. So this is one of the reasons why I think it's really important that we understand customers have access to an enormous amount of information. In fact, most of them are actually overloaded with it. They've got way too much stuff that they can actually get access to. And the question is this, how can we potentially help them with the challenges they have? Because having access to information is not the same thing as actually being able to use that information. So one of the things we can do is this. As salespeople, I think we can help them to reduce the complexity of their sales process. Because 3/4 of customers say that their last buying process was either complex or difficult or both. So how can we potentially help? So where can we help this process and by the same token gain trust and gain a customer in the process? Well, the first thing I think is we need to understand the customer's buying journey. What's actually involved in it? What makes it complex? So let's look at it in the simplest form. Okay, in the simplest form, it starts here. You have to identify the potential problem. Then you need to explore a potential solution and then build the requirements, which is typically what results in issuing a request for proposal. And then based on the proposals that you get, you select a vendor. Now, that seems incredibly simple. So where's the complexity? Well, this is not the reality. This is the reality. And that is where the complexity comes. Complexity comes from the fact that there are people involved in organizations, and just like belly buttons, each one has an opinion, and they want that opinion to be heard. And so as a result, there's a lot of back and forth all throughout this process, and it creates an enormous amount of complexity and noise inside. So what we need to understand is at each touch point along the way, between their buying process and our selling process, how can we potentially add value at those points? Remember, 3/4 of buyers say that they engage with the first sales organization to add value to their process. Well, let's figure out how to do that. So what we need to understand is at each phase in their buying process, what are their needs? What kind of information do they need? What kind of interaction do they need? What kind of support do they need? So if you have a look at these 4 initial phases of the customer's buying journey: problem identification, solution exploration, requirements building, and vendor selection. At each phase in the process, there are certain needs that customers have. And what we can do is, at each of those touch points, design our activities, our sales process, if you will, to support your customer's buying journey. Now, that buying journey, while it has the same basic steps, will be different from industry to industry. Some will take much longer in the first one and much shorter in the second one, and some vice versa. It all depends on what it is they're actually up to. What are they buying, and how complex is the solution? How difficult is it for them to figure out what their need is and to articulate it? So these elements here are not necessarily all uni-spaced and equal all throughout the process. We need to understand, for our customers, for the ones you deal with in your industry, what is the buying journey? What are the elements involved? So this means going out and engaging with your customers to understand what is their buying process. What is the information they need? What are the challenges they face? And how can we then help them to address those challenges and create value for them early in the process? So the challenge that we have is this. Oftentimes, if you look at those 4 steps in the process, typically where we get involved is here. Now, if you don't know the term RFP, you know it means request for proposal. And as I mentioned before, that's usually the result of that 3rd phase in the customer buying journey: requirements building. They define their requirements in a document, which is often sent out to a bunch of suppliers at request for proposal. And that's oftentimes where the selling process for many vendors begins. An RFP floats down and lands on your desk, and you go, woohoo, we have a sales opportunity. But the reality is, most of their buying process is actually over. And if other vendors were engaged earlier, here, for example, then more than likely the content of that RFP looks like an inverse of their solution rather than yours. So what you're being used for is simply to compare your solution to theirs and your price to theirs. Oftentimes to use only as leverage, because they don't really want to buy from anybody else. They've already been convinced that they want to buy from those guys. But the problem is they have, and this may be an organizational rule, or if you sell to the government, it's a legal requirement, they need to have 3 proposals. Well, what do? They send out an RFP and say they send out 3 proposals, but the RFP is written in a way that is only able to be answered fully by the vendor they've already selected. So the RFP is the end of the customer's buying process rather than the beginning of it. So if we can engage earlier, we're in a better position. We can actually influence the content of that RFP. This is where the art comes in, building relationships, again, in the digital age. And this is where the challenge comes in, is how do we do this in a digital age? Because it's a new school of thinking these days. It's not something that we can simply rely on the old tools that we were accustomed to. We need to leverage things like social media. And for many people, particularly in this crowd here, this is like, hey, my day has arrived. Finally, we're talking about social media. This is where my home crowd actually is. But it doesn't apply for everyone. There are many people that go, oh my God, not that, anything but that. So what I did is I looked at a couple of my clients. Now, many of my clients are in the old traditional industries, building materials and machine parts and things like that. And so I looked at all of their salespeople. So I looked them all up. I spent many, many, many hours on LinkedIn looking all of them up. And what I found is this: the profiles aren't very good. Actually, they're pretty downright terrible for the most part. In fact, in some cases, there was no profile at all. And I found that to be really, really interesting. But then many of my other clients, when they say, we're high-tech people, we know this stuff. We're good at technology. Okay, fine. Let's see how you do. Not much better. Really not much better. Because, again, this is not about technology. This is about communication. These are skills that can be learned and have to be taught. That's where the challenge really is can we actually create this competence that I think is critical for our current and our future success. Can we sell in a digital age? To me, this is a core competence for every successful salesperson today. Even the dinosaurs like me who are new to this game and need to learn how to act in this environment. Because our digital impression is oftentimes our first impression, and first impressions count. Because if they look for you and they don't find you, they think, well, they don't care. They don't care. They don't even bother to be here. Now, LinkedIn, for example, advertises itself as the world's #1 job site. And it probably is. I mean, it's present in more countries than most of the others like Monster and things like that. And many salespeople tell me, well, I don't have a profile on LinkedIn because I'm not looking for a job. Well, I have one word to say to that. And that word is bullshit. Okay, and the reason I say bullshit is because every salesperson should have in their mind the idea that every single customer meeting you attend is a job interview. Every single one, because we need to understand their decision-making process and they need to understand our capabilities because they are hiring us to solve their problem. That's what's actually happening. So every single customer interaction, that is a job interview. And we need to create our presence in a digital environment in a way that not only tells them we're here to be hired by you, but here is the value proposition we can bring to you. So how do we understand the customer's decision-making process? Because it isn't all that easy. So I call this the buying team. How can we understand who's involved in the buying process? Which role do they play in decision-making? So what exactly is this thing? Well, it is, as I said, it's the decision-making process. Now, empirically, it's pretty simple. Okay, you have a need, you find a solution, and you either say yes or no. Okay, that seems pretty easy. The problem is it doesn't work that simply. Okay, because between need and solution, you have all of these people, and they can be a pain in the butt. Now, what we have to do is this. We have to understand how each organization makes a decision. For example, in this case, it may go like this. It starts there, goes there, up to there, down to there, over to there, down to there, up to there, and back. Okay, so that is something we need to figure out for each and every organization because they're not all the same. And our job as a sales organization is to figure out who these people are and what role they play. So if we can figure out how this organization makes a difference and makes a decision and figure out who are the stakeholders in this case. This guy is holding a really big stake in this case. So who are the stakeholders in this case? Then we can better understand who is involved in that buying process and what they can do. So what we do is we use certain roles to help understand how an organization makes decisions because titles can be very misleading. One of my favorite titles, for example, is the title of Vice President because it's a title that means everything and it means absolutely nothing. I worked with a client some years ago that had about 6,000 people, 1,000 in Asia for whom they had one vice president, 2,000 in Europe, for which they had one vice president, and 3,000 in America, for which they had 400 vice presidents. So what's a vice president? I know these two guys. I mean, they were actually vice presidents. They reported directly to the CEO, but these vice presidents, not really. So rather than depending on a title, what we do is we look at roles in the organization. For example, who's the project sponsor? Who actually controls the cash and is able to take the cash out of the company's pocket and say, okay, we're going to spend this and we're going to spend it with you. Who are the people who actually make decisions about which solution is going to be bought? So they're the ones who are typically responsible for the project and oftentimes own the budget. Who are the people that evaluate different alternatives and say, okay, this one fits and that one doesn't? Oftentimes, these are the most problematic people because they have the right to say, no, you don't fit, you're out. But they can't actually say yes. They can't make a decision. That's other people who do that. And then we have people who oftentimes, because they have the right to say no, they confuse it with the right to say yes. And they'll tell you, I am the decision maker. And there usually is an inverse relationship. The more they say it, the less they actually are. So what we have to do is unmask them and figure out what they actually can do. Purchasing is one of those special decision makers. I mean, special, as we call them, evaluators, because they have different levels of power. For example, they have extremely high power when it's a straight rebuy. For example, if you're buying a commodity, paper or, the things that you buy every day, day in and day out, that's when they have the highest power. But as soon as there's even a small modification in that process, well, then there's an opportunity to redefine the value, and their power goes down and the other people become more important. When there's the lowest power is when things are new. If you're selling them something that's completely new, they will tell you they have high power, but the reality is they don't. So use that in your favor. And the last one are the users. The users are the ones who actually have a pragmatic view of things. Does it work? Does it not? Does it make my life easier? Do you provide support and things like that? And who can help us figure out who's who in the zoo? Because oftentimes users are actually never involved in the decision-making process. They're just sort of forced a solution upon them, and they're given the wrong tools with which to actually work. So you might end up trying to pump up that tire with that pump, for example. So completely inaccurate or inappropriate tools. Now, who can help us in this process? Well, the coach. The coach is someone that we develop, actually, somebody that we develop trust relationships with. And a good coach can help you to figure out where the noise level is. Who are the real decision makers? Where's the informal power structure? Where do people have relationships with competitors and things like that? Get away from all the hubbub and really figure out what's going on. But a coaching relationship, of course, is a silent partner. It's a private relationship just between me and you. It can't be something that's public. So why all of this work? Why trying to figure out who all these people are and building relationships? It seems like a hell of a lot of work. So why not just give them a discount? Seems a lot easier, right? I mean, just give them a discount. Well, my idea is any fool can sell for the lowest price. It takes talent to sell for a high price. And that's where the fun is, because people buy from the people they trust. So the question that begs is, how do you build trust? How do you build trust? I mean, trust is not a fact, it's an emotional. I choose to trust you, or I choose not to trust you. So how do you build trust? Well, here's a little equation that I like, and it really, really works in terms of helping us understand the elements of building trust. And it looks like this. T, which is trust, is equal to C plus R plus I divided by S. So what does C mean? C means credibility. Do you know what you're talking about? Can you present a clear, concise image of an understanding of the customer's business, their industry, your solution, how it works, and things like that? The second one is R, reliability. Do you make the right promises, and do you keep the promises you keep? And then the I, this is intimacy, not the squishy stuff we're talking about here. This is our ability to understand how the customer communicates, what their decision-making process is like, what their culture is like, and being able to work within that environment and adapt your abilities to it. Now, all of these three things, credibility, reliability, and intimacy, they're in the numerator, so you want to increase those. But there is something in the denominator here, S. What does that stand for? That stands for self-orientation, and that is in the denominator. So the higher the level of self-orientation, the more I talk like me, the more I talk about my products and my services and my solution and my company and me, the less the overall trust is, because then I'm not talking about you. Remember, the situation has changed. It's all about the customer. So we need to reduce our self-orientation. And if we can do that, we increase the total value of trust, because we've now melded into their organization, their way of thinking, their way of talking, their way of being. And this is one of the key things in building a good relationship. How do you do this? Well, ask more questions. Ask more questions. Prepare those questions, ask more questions, and then, for God's sake, listen to the answer. I can't believe how many times I've heard fantastic questions asked, and before the customer can actually listen to it, understand it, and formulate an answer, the person keeps right on talking. So the customer thinks, I guess they weren't interested in the answer. Okay, that's fine. We'll just let that go. So an opportunity to gather information was lost. So I want to teach you the 5 golden rules of silence right now, because this is what you're going to use. Once you ask a question, here are the 5 golden rules. Ready? Wait 5 seconds for the answer. Simple as that. Give them time to listen, understand, think, and respond. The longer you wait, the more you'll be rewarded with information. So the art, if you will, in selling is this. Stop selling. Start helping the customer to buy. That's the change I'd like you to make. So what about the science? This is the 80%, and I'm going to spend 20% of the time on it. Okay, so this is about these elements. People, we've already been talking about. Now we're going to talk about technology and process. Okay, so these are the 2 elements that I think are really important to understand. So these include things like using tools like artificial intelligence. This is all the rage these days. To me, there's a lack of real intelligence, and that's why they're trying to fill it with artificial stuff. But there's also digital scalability, there's automation. All of these things have a place in modern selling. There's no doubt about it. The question is, how can we use them in the most intelligent way? Well, one of the things that always comes up when it comes to the science is, well, we've got to manage customer relationships. We've got to manage all the interactions. We've got to do multi-channel. We've got to do all of this. And yes, all of those things are important. I totally agree. Okay. Unfortunately, what happens is this discussion oftentimes ends up being all about software. And really, that's not where it is. Because what often happens, and I see this happening all the time with CRM implementations, what they do is this. An organization says, well, we're buying CRM software, so you guys fix it. Well, they're software people. They're not salespeople, and they certainly don't know your industry. You need to tell them, actually. So it's got to go the other way around. You have to tell them, how do we sell, and have them adapt the software to us, not the other way around. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way very often. When it comes to things like artificial intelligence, is this useful? Yeah, of course it is. But it's artificial intelligence used intelligently, I think, can be a real boon to the customer relationship. But I think at the same time, it's often seen as a panacea, a solution that will solve every problem. And that simply is not the case. What really is required oftentimes is real intelligence. And this is where I think there's a real lack in industry these days, is they put their faith in things that they probably shouldn't put their faith into. So this is where I think we need to still think about what it is our customers need and help them to buy. How do we do this? Well, part of it is we need to have a good process. And that process has to be understood from both sides, from the customer's buying side and our selling side, and align those things in a way that helps our customers to buy, and to buy more easily. If we become the path of least resistance, then they're more likely to buy from us than somebody who makes it more difficult. So having a good process makes it easier for your salespeople to know what they should do next. It also makes it easier to bring new people into the organization. And when they ask, so how do you sell around here? Like this. Here is our process. Here are the tools, and they're aligned to that process. So when you come to a sales process, I mean, like this, the idea is that software should support the sales process. And depending on which stage you're in, whether you're creating opportunities, whether you're qualifying them, whether you're covering the buying team, creating your offer, supporting the decision process, implementing the solution, or developing a new opportunity, you should be systematic about it. And this is where I think technology can really help to make your sales process more repeatable, make the qualification more systematic, help people to understand what needs to be done, which questions should be answered before you invest resources in pursuing an opportunity. When you come to the offer, and I love this quotation from Guy Kawasaki, who used to be the chief marketing officer at Apple in his early days, and now he is a venture capitalist. And he said, in his profession, he reads a lot of proposals, and he says 95% of proposals suck. And then he said, no, I'm being generous. 98% of them suck. And the reason they're terrible oftentimes is because they are good proposals written for the wrong person. What fails to happen is this. There is no value proposition in that proposal. It's a parts list and a price list. And the people with whom we've been interacting oftentimes understand those because of the context of our discussions. But once a proposal is submitted, it often goes through many hands. It takes on a life of its own. And in that process, it loses meaning with every step through which it goes. So we need to be able to articulate, and that's why we say cover the buying team, understand in whose hands that proposal will end up, and make sure that your value propositions, individual ones, address each member of the buying team along the way. Then when it comes to decisions and implementation, the reason I put implementation into the sales process is because quite often right here, a little tiny bit of magic happens. As soon as the ink is dry on the contract, poof, the sales team disappears in a puff of smoke. It's really amazing. And it makes customers angry, because even though we have spent all this time building a relationship with a customer, we often forget that they invested the time building the relationship with us, and they feel abandoned many times. That's why I put implementation there, because we did a value proposition here. Well, this is value delivery. That's where the customer actually gets to experience the benefits that we promised. Up to that point, it's just blah, blah. That's where the rubber actually hits the road. And we have to have a process that helps us ensure that we deliver on the promises that we have made. And if we do a good job delivering, well, then the customer might ask us to solve another problem. And that's what we call account development. There are very few customers that actually want to be developed by their suppliers. They're busy developing themselves. So what we want to do is to help them solve another problem. That's the way they see it. So sales process is, again, it's a complex thing. And what I recommend is try to make your process as simple as possible. Okay, you don't want to create this Rube Goldberg machine to try and do the simplest task here. But sometimes, again, depending on what your organization sells, what we say is as simple as possible, but as complex as necessary. Now, for an organization that sells 100 million euro projects, typically there's a lot more steps involved, and these may be part of those kind of steps. But the key thing is to make sure that that technology, if you will, the science, actually works together with the art. So the sales process helps us to understand how we're going to help the customer buy. The technology is designed to work with it. So we need to integrate those tools into CRM systems so that salespeople don't have to make a choice. Do I do what I'm supposed to do or what the system tells me to do? Don't force them to make that choice, because then depending on the measure that you use, for example, if you choose to measure how many opportunities are in CRM versus how many they actually win, and guess what? They're going to spend the time on the wrong thing. They will choose the shortest path between them and their commission. So your measures need to be aligned with the objectives you're trying to achieve. So what I'm trying to advocate is the use of automation. Science is good, but it should be done intelligently. Okay, it shouldn't be done willy-nilly. It shouldn't be just slapped on the outside like, well, we need CRM software, so let's go buy some stuff. No, that's not it. The thinking process beforehand is far more important than whichever choice you make. The only sales process and sales tool that actually is worth anything is the one you actually use. So all of this comes right back to art. This is back to people. The tools should help you to coach. As leaders, we need to coach our people. That's how they grow. That's how they continue to improve their skills. That's how they continue to be motivated with that human connection. And we need to use the tools as well. It can't be simply an us and them, and those tools are for you and not for me. They have to be for all of us, and we have to work together in this. And they should enable the process. They should make it easier for people to use it. It shouldn't be simply a controlling tool to slap people on the hand. So when you do this, don't forget that even in science, a human touch is extremely important. We need to understand that it's people sitting in front of those machines. It's people that actually help us to differentiate, because people buy you first. than whatever you happen to be selling. It's people that help us differentiate. Art and science have to come together. So, do you use process automation? Yeah, of course you do. Particularly if you can reduce paperwork, because this is horrible. This is non-productive time. So get people out in front of customers. If you can reduce paperwork through automation, hallelujah, do it. If you can make information more accessible, hallelujah, do it. Because then they can make more intelligent decisions on the spot rather than having to wait to come back to the office and do all of it serially. So this is how the real job is done. There's been evolution over time, but the real job is people. And I want to give you an example of an artist and a scientist. This is the actress, a Hollywood actress from the 1950s named Hedy Lamarr. Now, she was a very successful actress. She was also an amazing scientist, because what she did, believe it or not, and it's affecting every single one of our lives today, she actually invented and patented, this is her patent, for frequency hopping. This is the technology that makes our mobile phones today work. She invented this. She was the original artist scientist. And that, to me, is the interaction or the intersection of science and art. That's where salespeople reside.